Well, first of all, Rebecca, thank you so much for making that beautiful film.
Thank you.
So touching, such beautiful footage, such well-crafted scenes and story.
Thank you. Thanks so much for hosting this webinar too. I'm really, really glad that we'll get to discuss this. So yeah, thanks again for that. I'm going to stop sharing my screen now.
All right. So for some people, this may be the first time they're really even learning that this is a thing. Lynn, I wonder if you can contextualize this a little bit for us. What happened here? How did we get here?
Well, we got here in part by underestimating the scope of anti-abortion activism and ideology and misogyny. So in the 80s and 90s, we started to recognize, the Supreme Court finally recognized that people have a say over how they will be treated when they die. And when the Supreme Court said that there is a right or a liberty interest in that, states began enacting advanced directive laws that said, you can decide what you want to have happen to you if you become unable to communicate your end-of-life wishes. But in order to get them approved and passed, and according to some, especially anticipating opposition from lobbyists from the Catholic Church, there were often provisions written in that said, you can plan your future and what healthcare you want, not if you're pregnant. And in fact, one state, I believe Connecticut, actually prohibited even creating an advance directive if you were pregnant. And as Catherine Taylor, who was one of the first people to write about this, said, this was an archaic anti-abortion, anti-woman ideology. These are all of recent making, mostly in the 90s and going on. So there are now 30 states, 28 by statute, that prohibit you, if you are pregnant, from having your wishes followed. And in, I think, about 22 of those states, even if the intervention that's being imposed to keep you alive causes you extraordinary pain, you still have to undergo it. So these are sometimes called pregnancy exclusion, but I'll stop here just to say they really are what they are gender discriminatory advance directive laws. And there has been some success fighting them, and I can talk about that later.
Well, can you say a little more about the underestimation of anti-abortion rhetoric and philosophy and how that factors in?
Well, we tend to focus in on abortion as the issue that represents sort of where the status of reproductive rights, health, and even justice are. But underlying today's anti-abortion movement is the ideology that not just fetuses, but fertilized eggs, embryos, and fetuses should be treated as if they are already separate, and not really with their own rights, but with the power of the state to control pregnant women. And these laws are one more place where we see that anti-abortion ideology affects people who don't want abortions, who wouldn't want to have an abortion. It affects the status of anybody who has the capacity for pregnancy. And if you have trouble wrapping your head around what's the discrimination, a person who can't get pregnant, a man who can't get pregnant, can be assured that whatever his plans are will be followed, and that he can ensure that his wishes will be respected, and those wishes affect the family members he leaves behind. If you have the capacity for pregnancy, you're told, no, you do not have a right to have the security or assurance that what you want to have happen to you at the end of your life will actually be followed if you do get pregnant.
Or you're not even told.
Well, that's all.
You find out.
Yeah. Well, most states, and this is a place of activism, in the states that have these laws, many times the forms that you can get online for your advance directives don't warn you that there's an exception, an exclusion, a discrimination against the people who can get pregnant. And so that's one form of action, to make sure states actually inform people. People in Connecticut, I think most recently, were able to take back the gender discriminatory part of their laws. and several other states as well. And that should be a priority. And it's of the same thing. We're waiting for a decision from the Supreme Court on abortion. At the same time, there are all these other places that also impact the lives of women.
Well, and that for both of you, what is the status of Marlise's Law?
Well, I can speak a bit about that. I want to add to what Lynn just said so well, because one of the things that drew me to this film and to this family was the fact that everything you're describing is exactly what happened to them. They never would have presumed that they would find themselves in the middle of ostensibly an abortion debate, is what it felt like. Marlise Muñoz didn't have an abortion. She died when she was pregnant. But that's because we tend to associate these so-called fetal protection laws or personhood laws with abortion, when in fact they have all this other impact. And that was really my goal in the film, to show what the human toll of that actually is, how that played out for this family. So I'm glad you mentioned that. I could speak to Marlise's Law at the moment. The short version is it hasn't changed too much. This past year was the third attempt, and Lynn, if I'm incorrect, you can jump in, but the third attempt to change the law in Texas. So what we saw at the end of the film was the first time that Marlise's Law was proposed. It's since had different sponsors and somewhat different variations, but the gist of it has been the same. Each time the Texas state legislature, like I guess a lot of legislatures, I didn't know anything about this until I made the film. Many of you know, I'm sure your audience knows way more about this than I did, but I was shocked to learn that the Texas state legislature is only open for 6 months every 2 years. So this was the third round. It did advance further, a little further each time. So it was voted out of committee this time, but it then didn't go any further than that. So the family and the advocates who are working with them and their lawyers are all very eager to keep going. They're committed to this, but we haven't seen the impact that they're hoping for yet.
Go ahead, Lynn.
I would just add, however, and Rebecca, correct me if I'm wrong, that two things. One is, for any positive bill to pass, it often takes years of trying over and over again. So that's quite typical. But also, one of the reactions to what happened in Texas is Louisiana amended its law to specifically permit appropriating the body of a dead woman to use to procreate, in this horrific experimental thing to try to gestate a fetus. Shortly after, that was it was shortly after, and clearly in reaction to the news about Marlise Muñoz, they put that in. And there was actually a rival bill at the time that I was filming this, which I didn't put in the film, mostly because I made a choice that I was going to follow the family's journey, that would be the structure of the film, was really Eric's story and her mother Lynn's story. And so since that other bill didn't advance at all, it didn't make sense, but it was at the same time that Marlise's Law was proposed. It was by a representative named Matt Krause, and I forget what it was called. It had some very long name, like Save the Unborn Child. I'm not going to get it correct, but the gist of it was that it would do what Louisiana wanted to do, which would be to say that even in the case of brain death, explicitly, a person would need to remain on support, regardless of whatever advance directive they may have thought they had. And that if there was any contention about that a guardian ad litem would be appointed for the fetus. So, I don't know, that bill didn't go very far, but doesn't mean it isn't going to pop up again. It seems perfectly likely that it could.
Wow. So two directions I want to go in. One, we got a comment from a participant just wanting to clarify that in many states, the living will portion, where you can state the type of care that you want if you become incapacitated, is actually not legally binding. But the designation of a patient advocate is legally binding. So it's possible that even men couldn't assure that their wishes would be carried out. And so the importance of just determining who your healthcare advocate is one step that people can make. So just wanted to clarify that, but that leads me to a question about informed consent. The advanced directive laws really came out of a common law principle of informed consent, which we know from other cases in the labor and birth realm is a hard right to really get redress for when it's violated for pregnant folks in particular. Can you speak a little more to that, Lynn?
In terms of the general concept, well, I think having been a patient in general, that it is hard between humans to articulate what you want and to have it respected if people disagree with you or think it's better for you or your family. And that's not necessarily unique to pregnancy. But in the context of pregnancy, there is so much cultural and historical efforts to control pregnant patients that they may not, their explicit refusal, for example, of cesarean surgery, as Renatre in New York did, may be met by a doctor who writes in the records, patient has decisional capacity and we are overriding it. Without actual legal support that is based on legal principles, completely unjustified, a complete violation of informed consent. And yet, I think as humans, we are so unresolved about how we think about a person who is pregnant and is not, as Hannah Roberts says, is not two, but is not exactly one, that we sort of think of pregnant women as a group of people who are separate and unequal, who may be deprived of rights other folks have. And I appreciate the comment that suggested that maybe I overstated the amount of control that anybody has. But one of the other avenues of control around pregnancy and advanced directives is, even if you write your living will, you write your advanced directives, and you appoint somebody as your healthcare proxy, as your surrogate decision maker, some of the ways in which the state laws work is to restrict the surrogate's ability to act on your behalf when you're pregnant.
Right. And that's essentially what happened in the case of Marlise Muñoz. I mean, there was no disagreement amongst her family members. There was never a time when the hospital questioned her advanced directive or anything. It was just that they decided it was completely void, regardless of what Eric said as well. So.
I found it striking, the moment in the film when it's revealed that the care providers themselves also disagreed. That reminded me of Angela Carter's case as well.
Exactly. Yeah. In that case, a woman who was critically ill, was 25 years old and 27 weeks pregnant. And even though her attending physicians, her parents, her husband all agreed that the right thing to do was to try to prolong her life as long as possible, got a court order to force her to have cesarean surgery that resulted in both her death and the birth of a non-viable fetus. Yeah. And exactly this, many of these cases do arise where there's a conflict between the doctor and the patient. But Marlise Muñoz and Angela Carter, no conflict at all. And still, it exemplifies how intrusive state action can be, or hospitals acting under the belief that they have certain authority.
You mentioned the unresolved, cultural phenomenon in terms of not quite one, but not quite two. I also just think this film did such a good job of really showing how tricky that line is between what is life and what is death. Like, what is even death? Not just what is life, and what is human? What is Eric at one point said something about how it felt so dehumanizing. I just thought that was profound in this, there's this way that what is human is maybe separate from what is life and what is death.
Well, I can speak to that, to the sense that, one of the reasons I even decided to make this film was because this was in the news. It wasn't that anyone wasn't talking about it, but it was so, kind of sensationalized, and everything was quick sound bites. And the way that it was portrayed, I think, to a lot of people who might have supported this law or who felt this seemed like a good idea, was this idea that Marlise Muñoz was somehow resting peacefully, sleeping in a hospital, you know, and it would just be a little patient, and a wonderful miracle can occur. And that was absolutely the narrative that was presented to them. And that was not the experience, clearly, that Eric faced, that anyone who loved her faced, or that anyone in the medical community who were treating her were aware of. So I felt like it was really important to show that, you know, to show that this isn't just some idea of
Snow White,
you know, Sleeping Beauty, yeah, exactly, whatever Disney princess, you know, and then she's gonna wake up and everything's great. There's a baby, it's a miracle, everyone's happy. That's not at all what happened, and it was beyond traumatizing for Eric to experience having to sit with his dead wife for 62 days and observe this, and all these people who were out there in front of the hospital with their life signs were completely disregarding the lives of the family who were experiencing this at the moment.
One thing I've learned or taken away from having represented Angela Carter's parents is the irony that the vision of pro-life that really is attractive because we want life, we want to support it, is pro-life for everybody except those who are pregnant. Because in the Angela Carter case, they literally said she's going to die anyway. She was actually still alive, but their view of her, those defending the forced cesarean, and the people outside as well who consider outside of the hospital there. But I also wanted to point out that in many of the cases that get a lot of public attention, there's debate about whether the person's alive or dead. One of the interesting things in this case is there was no dispute. Everybody agreed that she was not alive by any medical definition that anybody accepts. And part of what I think has got not enough attention, although one of the lawyers did articulate this, is this was illegal research on human subjects. If you think back to Tuskegee, the syphilis experiments, experimenting on people without their consent, there's no research, there is no protocol for appropriating dead bodies and using them to gestate fetuses. There's nothing. So this was illegal research on human subjects that should have been stopped by the office of I can't remember which federal office it is that oversees funding for hospitals around their research, whether they do it with federal money or not.
So that's a good segue to a question that I'll paraphrase from the audience. Are either of you aware of any theologians actually coming out as opposed to these kinds of laws or this kind of treatment? It seems like there's an opportunity here, especially in the cases where, you know, essentially someone's death is dehumanized for some theological perspective. I don't know. Are you aware?
Well, I mean, there's probably a broader answer to this that I know. I can, you know, one of the reasons I included, and it's just a clip in the film, but it was a longer interview when I was making the movie, the interview with the Machado family's pastor, is because that he sort of had this take of, you know, if we don't intervene, if we had been there, like she would have passed away, the baby would have passed away too, let God be God, and however he put it, and said it so matter-of-factly. And I was clearly aware that many others would use sort of a religious justification for exactly what they were doing to Marlise. The doctor who is in the film, Karen Smith, who speaks about how, well, she is pro-life, but you know, she feels that this case, it's very interesting because she's come to a lot of screenings since we made this film, and she has really altered her views. I wonder if she's watching this now. I think she'd be happy to speak up about it because she's been very outspoken. I'm like, one person changed their mind because of this film, so that's a start. Doesn't consider herself pro-life anymore because of her, she's also a minister. Sorry, I forgot to mention that. She's also a minister, right? So because she felt that her theological take on this was clearly at odds with the medical take on this, and then as well the kind of personal family trauma, and it altered the way she looked at this. And she said to me since then, you know, that law would have looked perfectly good to me on the book. And it took seeing what happened to this family for me to really change my perspective. Again, that's one person, but my hope is that this film can help do that, because I think we do tend to feel, especially within certain religious communities, that everything must be polarized, right? That it's either you're pro-life or pro-choice, that it's either you know, support one way or the other. And I think hopefully this case really showed that it's more complicated than that.
I know we invited some people who do death doula work to be here today. And, you know, I just imagine that in that work, you see how life-affirming death can be and how things like the Muñoz family experienced really, you know, undermines even the life-affirming opportunities that exist in death. So shout out to you death doulas out there.
Well, Indra, could you just explain for folks who don't know what a death doula is?
So just, you know, a doula is somebody generally thought of it to provide emotional and physical support to people during pregnancy and birth. But there's been a movement to provide that same sort of physical and emotional support to people who are experiencing the dying process, including the family members of the person who is dying. So I think we have time for maybe one more question. And I know we've touched on a little bit about what other states are doing or how people can advocate to change the laws in their state. Are you aware of any other states that are taking action? Are you aware of any other, you know, legal battles going on about this?
So in response, I think that there are a couple of things people should do in addition to activism around repealing or challenging such laws. First of all, everybody watching should find out if their state has a discriminatory advance directive law. Everybody should fight to repeal those, though most recently again in Connecticut. And if you're looking for a good model law, apparently New Jersey's law, current law, is very good in terms of ensuring that whatever people want is respected, whether they're pregnant or not. You can challenge the state to at least inform people if they have a discriminatory advance directive law. And everybody should, no matter how young they are, is fill out a living will and appoint a healthcare proxy. It's something you should revisit over the course of your life because your views might change, who you want to trust to make the decisions if you can't might change. But everybody should do that. And those really prompt excellent conversations about what one should do at end of life and beginning of a new life. And if you are in a state that prohibits you from having control over what happens to you, if you are pregnant at the time you can't articulate, do living will civil disobedience. Write on that form. I don't care what the law, my position is this should happen, and the person I've appointed as my healthcare proxy not only has the authority to carry out my wishes if I'm pregnant, they have my authority to bring a lawsuit to challenge something that interferes with my ability to have my wishes carried out.
Nice. I understand, and maybe later this year we can even have a webinar about this. I understand there was a legal challenge in Idaho over Idaho's advanced directives law. I don't know if you know much about it.
Rebecca may know more about it. I just started off by saying the group called Legal Voice has brought a challenge. And from a lawyer's point of view, miraculously, it has not yet been thrown out. The hardest part of these cases in the past is people who have the capacity for pregnancy file a lawsuit and say, you're preventing me from planning my life. And the courts come back and say, oh, you don't have a real case in controversy. Come back when you're actually brain dead and want this, or come back when you're incapacitated. It's sort of the courts really have closed their doors or try to close their doors to claims that challenge pregnancy discrimination. But Rebecca, you probably know more about that.
Well, no, I mean, you said it well. I know that it was Legal Voice. They were also in coalition with an organization that I'm going to blank the name on, but an end of life organization. Choices in something. Anyway, I'll find out. And I'll
Compassionate choices.
Compassionate choices. Thank you. And it was exactly what you said. Legally, you know, their challenge was standing. Who has standing to start this lawsuit? They did have 4 pregnant individuals who put their names on the lawsuit. It didn't advance to the point they wanted it to, but it's still in limbo to my knowledge. And they're another organization that's doing great work, just like National Advocates for Pregnant Women on this. But yeah, I don't think it's gone further.
And do you know if people are interested in joining the effort in Texas? Who's behind that? ACLU was in the film.
Yeah, I mean, there's more than one organization. There's a whole coalition of organizations there as well that working in reproductive justice. But the ACLU, because they were so closely involved with the family in this first time, they've remained very, very committed to trying to change this law. And we've screened the film with them in the state capitol in Texas several times. We've had different, they've had different people, I think I mentioned this before, sponsoring different iterations of the bill, and they've had other organizations that are supporting that as well, but they're doing a lot of really great work on this now.
Just a couple final thoughts first. If any of you are also in Colorado like me, I'm talking to one of our senators about this issue on Monday. Please contact me and join me if you're interested. And then a suggestion from the audience: what about putting on the advance directive that in the event of incapacitation, you don't consent to an inquiry into your pregnancy status?
I like
Any
it.
thoughts on that? Yeah.
I think there are some states that actually may require a pregnancy test, but I think that's a really brilliant idea. And I mean, then we have to fight about whether anybody follows it.
Right. I was just going to say it's tricky because in the moment of crisis, if it were a case like Marlise Muñoz, Eric willingly shared that she was pregnant because he was in a moment of emergency crisis. Oh my gosh, you can imagine when he was there, and he's a paramedic, right? So we knew this. We have to help my wife. She's 14 weeks pregnant. There was no part of him that in that moment felt this was something he would need to conceal in order to have her wishes granted. Yeah. So I think that it's sort of a workaround, but not necessarily in a given situation, right?
Yeah.
But I think what it does do is it expresses the feeling of the person who's filling it out, that is not an inquiry I think should be made.
Yeah.
On the other hand, New York does now have laws addressing what happens at end of life and what happens if you don't have a living will. And the way they addressed it seemed right to me, which was to say that you should figure, if there aren't instructions, when you're trying to figure out what a person who's pregnant would have wanted, you do think about, would they have wanted to keep going or not? People have very different feelings about it. And the point of healthcare proxies and surrogate decision-making is to carry out the wishes of that person, whatever they might be. And for some people, they would want every measure to be used to try to bring forth the life that they're carrying. And we would defend and advocate for them as well if somebody was interfering with that.
Thank you. I think that idea also just begs the question of what are these pregnancy tests? How is it that we even know these things? So I point folks who are interested to one of our webinars from last year, which was on the history of the pregnancy test. Very interesting. So I think we should wrap up for today. Obviously, this is a topic we could just keep talking about, and I so appreciate both of you being here to talk with us about this. And again, thank you so much for that beautiful film.
Thank you. Thank you so much for hosting this and for everyone for listening. It's really great to get the film out there.
Thank you, Indra.
Thanks. Farewell, all.
Okay.